their own former agent Mr. Siringo, the agency was also not above hiring murderers, namely one Tom Horn, who had a long history of working as a hired gun, and a fair portion of that time he also worked for the Pinkertons. Work that was so valued that when Tom Horn was captured after holding up a gambling hall in Reno, Nevada, Robert Pinkerton stepped in and got him released because the Pinkertons couldn't let him go to jail while he was working for them. What had he done to earn such loyalty from the head of the Pinkertons, you may ask? Well, he had killed a lot of people. According to his later confession, Tom Horn admitted to killing at least 17 men during what is known as the Colorado Range War, where he was paid by rich ranchers $600 a head to kill supposed cattle rustlers. To prove he was responsible and collect his bounty, Horn would leave a stone under the head of those he killed like it was a pillow. It was his signature. And it's not like these killings happened in the heat of the moment either, as Horn was cold and calculating in these murders. For example, Horn would relate to Siringo the story of two men he was contracted to kill. The first he laid in wait for and killed as he was getting a drink of water from a spring, ambushing him while he was distracted. As for the other man, Horn rode out to his cabin as if he was there to pay him a visit. Indeed, Horn's victim would actually invite the killer in and offer him a meal. Then, after eating together, Horn actually waited until the other man finished cleaning up after dinner to shoot him. But it's not like he just finished his job and left either, as Horn spent the rest of the night in the cabin with the corpse. And this wasn't even the most disturbing tale involving Tom Horn that Siringo would relay. That honor is probably reserved for a tale Horn told Siringo one night over drinks. This is directly from his book, quote, "He told of how while an Indian scout in Arizona, some soldiers had a fight with a band of Indians, all of whom were supposed to have been killed. 3 days later, he and 3 soldiers were riding over the battleground. One of these soldiers noticed a live 3-year-old baby upon its dead mother's breast trying to nurse. The soldier called his companion's attention to it. Then Horn said he remarked to the soldier that he would fix the little brat, so he spurred his horse up to the baby and leaning over put a bullet in the urchin's brain." Even at the end of Tom Horn's career as a murderer, when he was finally arrested for the killing of 14-year-old Willie Nickel, a murder which he actually may not have been responsible for, Charles Siringo said that Robert Pinkerton told him that he could have saved Horn, and the only reason why he didn't was because doing so would have revealed his connection to the famous agency that had been kept secret up until that point. Yet, even with all of that, we're still only scratching the surface of the underhanded dealings that the Pinkertons were involved in. Before we go any further, I think it's important that we get some background on this time period, and more importantly for this story, we have to understand the working conditions in the factories and the mines of this era. Understand that most people worked between 12 and 16 hours per day, 6 days a week without any paid holidays or vacations. And it's not like they were well paid for all of this work. Their wages would barely cover their cost of living if they even did that. Additionally, temperatures in these factories could climb into the triple digits due to their poor ventilation and the heat generated from the huge machinery, none of which had the kind of safety covers or precautions you'd expect to see today. Plus, if in the very likely chance you were injured while working with these very dangerous machines and no longer able to work, you'd be fired with no compensation. Then there were the children. They too worked in these dangerous factory conditions because they were cheaper to hire than their adult counterparts, and they were more obedient because they were, kids. Plus, their small little hands were useful in unclogging the machinery. They could reach in places where adults couldn't fit their hands, often in between parts that if the machinery was running properly would be spinning dangerously. In other words, this was an accident just waiting to happen, and even when they weren't attempting that dangerous feat, the factory floor was not a safe place. To illustrate this, I will now read a passage from the 1828 memoir of Robert Blincoe, where he describes the fate of one Mary Richards, who was not quite 10 years old and working in a factory. Quote, "It happened one evening when her apron was caught by the shaft. In an instant, the poor girl was drawn by an irresistible force and dashed on the floor. She uttered the most heart-rending shrieks. The factory overseer ran toward her, an agonized and helpless beholder of a scene of horror. He saw her whirled round and round with the shaft. He heard the bones of her arms, leg, thighs, etc. successfully snap asunder, crushed seemingly to atoms. As the machinery whirled her round and drew tighter and tighter her body within the works, her blood was scattered over the frame and streamed upon the floor. Her head appeared dashed to pieces. At last, her mangled body was jammed in so fast between the shafts and the floor that the water being low and the wheels off the gear, it stopped the main shaft. When she was extracted, every bone was found broken, her head dreadfully crushed. She was carried off quite lifeless. It wasn't just factories or death traps for children either. Working in a mine seemed to have been just as bad, if probably not worse, than life in the factories. Boys could start working in the mines legally at 12, but it doesn't seem like it was unusual for boys as young as 9 to lie about their age to bosses who surely would have known better. These children would start off working in the mines as what was known as a breaker. They would sit on a hard bench by a long chute where coal would pass by, and they'd be responsible to pick out any slate or rock that was mixed in with the coal, oftentimes cutting and scarring their hands in the process. The whole time they would also be breathing in coal dust, which could lead to a condition known as black lung, which is a scarring inside of your lungs from trying to constantly cough out the coal dust. Then, when they were quote-unquote old enough, these boys could become full-fledged miners. A typical day for a miner would start at 5, and they work for an average of at least 10 hours in the mine for 300 days out of a year, making less than $1.60 a day. As they did so, they were also in constant danger, whether it be from having a roof caving in, burning to death from exploding methane gas, being blown into teeny tiny bits by a premature explosion, or having something go wrong with the ventilating furnace which they needed to provide air. Plus, there was always the threat of fire, which could burn away the mine's oxygen supply, or they could also drown if a mine's pumping system broke down and the tunnels flooded. Because of these dangers, coal miners could not get ordinary life insurance, as in one 30-year span at the end of the 19th century, 10,000 men and boys were killed with another 25,000 injured, all thanks to coal mining. These miners also had to provide their own tools, which included a hand drill, scraper, needle, blasting barrel, crowbar, pick, shovel, hammer, sledge, cartridge pin, oil can, toolbox, and lamp, all of which oftentimes they had to buy from the company store. Which brings us to the phenomenon of company towns. Certain factories, railroad construction sites, lumber camps, and mines were not conveniently located near established towns, so new ones had to be made to support the workers at these various sites. Sometimes they were created with a paternalistic vision of a utopian town for the workers, where schools, churches, and libraries would be built to create a better community, while places like, say, a saloon would not only not be built but prohibited because of their potential negative influence on the town. Others, though, didn't even bother with that thin veneer pretending to do what was right by their workers, and simply took advantage of the situation. You see, because these towns were isolated and options for travel limited, the workers not only had to live in company-owned houses, but they also had to buy everything from company-owned stores. And of course, the prices were high in such stores because there was no competition, and the workers had no other choice. Some company towns took things even further by not even paying their workers with United States currency, but with what was known as company scrip instead. Company scrip was currency that was only good at the company's store, so even if you did manage to travel to another town to buy needed supplies and groceries, your money would be no good there. You had to buy from the company store. Not only that, but with the high prices and low wages, these workers often had to go into debt to the company just to afford housing or groceries or the necessary equipment to do their jobs. And every week it could get worse as your paycheck would be less because of the money you had borrowed the week before, so you would have to borrow even more money to cover your weekly needs. And it's not like you could just quit and find another better paying job once that started, because you had to keep working for the company until your debt to them was paid off. Pullman, Illinois was one of these company towns. It was built by the owner of the Pullman Palace Car Company, George M. Pullman, as a model town for his workers to live in. Pullman, whose company built luxury sleeper cars, became rich thanks to the booming U.S. economy and massive railroad growth. Now, in the beginning, the Pullman towns weren't necessarily a bad thing. Compared to other housing of the time where several families could live in one tenement, Pullman workers lived in 2 to 7 room houses complete with indoor plumbing. Yet, while the living conditions were probably better than average, the rent was also about 25% higher than normal for the area. Still, Pullman claimed that his goal was to build a quote-unquote model town for his workers, complete with a library and parks safely away from the seductions of nearby Chicago. Now, obviously, trying to exercise this level of control over your workers is problematic. Pullman clearly wanted control over his workers' lives, and he wanted to keep them from exploring other opportunities. Still, everything operated relatively smoothly for about a decade, with the workers receiving their paychecks from the Pullman Bank with their rent already deducted. Then came the Panic of 1893, when millions lost their jobs, railroads went bankrupt, prices collapsed, and wages plummeted. Pullman was not immune from this. Far from it. He laid off a third of his workforce and cut wages by 30% or more. What he didn't cut, though, was the rent on the houses that his remaining employees were living in, which means that the money his workers living in his so-called model town brought home dropped dramatically. Then, when the workers formed a committee to request that Pullman lower the rent, he refused and fired 3 members of the committee. In response, his workers went on strike. The Pullman Strike of 1894 was the first national strike in American history, as the American Railway Union led by Eugene V. Debs came to aid their cause. Railway workers all across the nation started boycotting trains using the Pullman cars. An effective and nonviolent tactic, one that made railroad executives extremely nervous. These executives notably had President Grover Cleveland's ear, which led to his response of sending in the troops. Violent clashes ensued with potentially dozens killed as the strike was effectively ended. Now, this happened in 1893, and 1894 was an election year, and this wasn't a great look for those in Washington. So, 6 days after Grover Cleveland sent in the troops, both houses of Congress unanimously passed a bill which he would sign making Labor Day a national holiday as an attempt to appease the nation's labor unions, a move that failed as Grover Cleveland would not be re-elected. This is the world we find ourselves in for many Americans at the end of the 1800s and the beginning of the 1900s. The question then becomes, what do the workers who find themselves basically trapped in these conditions do, and for the purposes of this episode, how do the Pinkertons play a role? To answer those questions, let's first start with the Molly Maguires, that secretive Irish allegedly terrorist organization taken down single-handedly by Pinkerton super detective James McParland. The name Molly Maguires originally came from early 19th century Ireland. The real Molly Maguire was an Irish widow who in the 1840s protested against the English landlords who were trying to steal the land that the people were living on. She led a group called the Anti-Landlord Agitators, who were famous for getting into actual bare-knuckle brawls with the landlords. The group, though, started calling themselves the Molly Maguires and would yell, "Take that from a son of Molly Maguire," after they had attacked someone. Then came the Irish potato famine from 1845 to 49, which is another topic worthy of its own deep dive, but for the sake of this story, we will focus on the over 1 million Irish who immigrated to America as a result. Once there, to no one's surprise, they were discriminated against because they were Irish, and because they were Catholic. Help wanted signs often had the added line that Irish need not apply. Some of these Irish immigrants were able to find work as miners in the coal-rich region of Pennsylvania, specifically Schuylkill County. Mining conditions here were extremely dangerous, as previously discussed, and while there was a group working towards safer mining conditions called the Workingmen's Benevolent Association, it didn't really cater towards the needs of the workers, and was prejudiced towards the Irish. So they decided to form their own group called the Ancient Order of the Hibernians, which I will be referring to as the AOH for obvious reasons. Only Irishmen or sons of Irishmen were allowed to be members of this organization, and they fought for the Irish working class and against those who would mistreat them. Spurred on by the Great Panic of 1873, which was one of the worst depressions in American history, and what also caused the Pullman strike, mine bosses took this as an opportunity to go onto the wages of their miners. Notably, the new contract that they imposed on their workforce lowered pay from between 10 to 20%. This move would be the catalyst for the Long Strike of 1875, which involved 7,000 miners and lasted for 7 months. Now, there had been violent incidents in this region ever since the start of the Civil War, as the poorer miners rebelled against the idea of being drafted into what they saw as a rich man's war. These incidents would of course escalate as the conditions in the region worsened, with 24 mine foremen and supervisors killed by the end of this period. All of these deaths would then be laid at the doorstep of the Molly Maguires by Pinkerton Detective James McParland, and end with another 20 additional men hanged for their involvement. Hired by Franklin B. Gowan, the president of the Reading Railroad, McParland, under the name James McKenna, would spend 2.5 years in the region, infiltrating the ranks of the miners, becoming a member of the AOH, and supposedly joining the secret ranks of the Molly Maguires. Then, in 1875, Gowan's private coal and iron police, with the help of the Pinkertons, arrested 60 men accusing them of being a part of the Molly Maguires, arrests that just also happened to help break the strike that was plaguing Gowan's company and others in the region. On June 21, 1877, 20 men who were supposedly a part of the secret Molly Maguire organization were hanged for first-degree murder. They were notably found guilty by a jury that specifically excluded Irish Catholics, and consisted of German and Pennsylvanian Dutch who had trouble understanding the testimony and arguments given in English. which might have been important seeing as how the testimony and evidence provided was circumstantial at best, and notably relied heavily on the word of McParland of the Pinkertons, who had been paid by the same mine owners that these men were striking against. Nowadays, many historians and even the state of Pennsylvania doubt